Now Trump is starting negotiations. Now the Europeans and Zelensky are saying, oh my God. Well, Europe should have been negotiating.
Out of the 720 members of the European Parliament, which one of them, majority of 500 of them, they vote to continue this war, to keep sending weapons.
Let me mention a secret to the members of Parliament. If the United States stops, the war's going to stop. All of this came about because of American arrogance and stupidity. This goes back 30 years. If people really think that this started on February 22nd, 2022, my God, they could understand what it means for my country, the United States, to have been engaged in 100 regime change operations since the end of World War II, 100. In March 2022, the Russians and Ukrainians say, okay, we can settle this on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. The United States and Britain told Ukraine, don't sign that agreement. Fight on.
How should we think about foreign policy as Europe?
If Europe acts like 27 individual countries, I'm sorry, it's going to get picked to pieces. How's it going to deal with Russia? How's it going to deal with China? How's it going to deal with the United States, if I could put it quite bluntly? The past ideas of Biden were the unipolar world. The current ideas are we take what we want. If we want Greenland, Canada, Panama, Gaza, we take it. Europe is going to need to have diplomacy.
Not delusional diplomacy.
Can I call it grown-up diplomacy? Not childish diplomacy, not propaganda-based diplomacy, not slogan-based diplomacy, not Russophobic diplomacy or Sinophobic diplomacy, but real diplomacy. NATO should have been disbanded in 1991 when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded and when the Soviet Union ended. The goal of NATO, of the US, it is to surround Russia. If you look at the Black Sea, you would have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia completely surrounding Russia. For the United States, this was a game. For Russia, this is core national security. Who do you think is going to win?
Who are you? I know a lot of people know you, but introduce yourself. It's interesting to see how you introduce yourself.
I'm Jeff Sachs. I'm a professor at Columbia University and have been involved in global affairs and economic development for a long time. So,
I'm very excited today because you are not, with your brain, you are not only just giving your opinion, but you recently and for a long time, you are influencing also politics, which is amazing, just with your intellect and your opinion to influence politics around the world without being in big positions in politics. So it's amazing. I'm very excited. But there is a lot of news that we need to talk about. And recently you didn't give talks about the recent news about Ukraine and all this stuff. So how do you see the current state of the negotiations that is happening now without Europe, just with Russia and United States? Explain everything about this.
Well, first, thank God there are negotiations. This war can end. And Europe should have been involved in negotiations with Russia, but it said no. Ukraine should have been involved with negotiations with Russia, but Zelensky actually issued a decree back in October 2022, no negotiations. So there were no negotiations. Now Trump is starting negotiations. Now the Europeans and Zelensky are saying, oh my God. Well, Europe should have been negotiating. My advice to Borrell for years was go to Moscow, go talk. You're the diplomat. Didn't happen because the attitude here was, unfortunately, Russia's the enemy. We must defeat Russia on the battlefield. We must militarize. And so there were no diplomats around. All the people who called themselves diplomats were basically arms salesmen. They weren't engaged in diplomacy. Now we finally have some diplomacy started. It's good.
It's crazy to me a lot. Like majority, out of the 700 members of the European Parliament, which one of them, 720, majority of 500 of them, they vote to continue this war, to keep sending weapons. So it's no wonder that they don't want us into negotiation. And I heard
Let me mention a secret to the members of parliament. If the United States stops, the war is going to stop. The United States has provided the arms, the financing for the armaments, the logistics. The Europeans can talk about continuing the war. I think it's a tragedy if they do, but it's not going to happen, actually. The war will end.
What we could do better as Europeans to be more influential in this thing and to play a part of these talks?
Well, all of this came about because of American arrogance and stupidity. Sorry to say. This goes back 30 years. I hope some people here understand that. This is not something that Putin started, although that's everybody's line. But if someone actually knows some history, and I do go back with advising Ukraine and Russia and the Soviet Union before that, so I've been involved personally in these issues since 1989. This is U.S. arrogance that goes back to 1992 when the Americans said, we run the world, we're the unipolar, sole, indispensable nation of the world, sole superpower. And then in 1994, Bill Clinton said, okay, we'll expand NATO and it'll just keep going eastward. We told the Soviets we won't move 1 inch eastward, doesn't matter. We're going to do it. We're Americans. We do whatever we want. And Zbig Brzezinski, people here know, they should go back and read his grand chessboard book, 1997, where he lays out Washington policy. He actually has a chapter, what will Russia do as NATO expands eastward? And his conclusion is they can't do anything. They'll have to agree to whatever the United States says. So people should learn a little bit of history. They should understand that the United States, their ally, destabilized the nuclear arms control framework in 2002 by unilaterally withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was the single most destabilizing action by the United States, even more than so many other terrible things, because the nuclear arms framework is the centerpiece of stability with Russia. And the United States unilaterally walked out. The Russians were extraordinarily upset about this. And then the US started placing anti-ballistic missile systems in Poland and Romania, these Aegis missile systems. And listen to what the Russians are saying. It would be like Russia putting missile bases in Mexico or Canada. Do you think America would say, well, that's their business. You know, how can we have any concern? And then if the United States expressed a concern, Russia would say, well, but Canada wants it or Mexico wants it. This is the childish attitude of the United States. Then in 2014, the United States participated in a violent coup that overthrew the Ukrainian government. And within a nanosecond of that violent coup, the US said, we recognize that new government. And then came the Minsk Agreement. And the Minsk II agreement was backed by the UN Security Council. And what did Ukraine and the United States decide behind the scenes? We don't have to take that seriously. Forget it. We don't like that agreement. That was at gunpoint. UN Security Council backs this unanimously. The United States says, no, don't worry about it. So the war continues already from 2014 to 2021. Tremendous shelling and deaths in the Donbas region. Then Putin says at the end of 2021, we need a new security arrangement between Europe and Russia, between the United States and Russia. Europe, of course, doesn't act at all because it has no foreign policy other than obeying the United States. The United States tells Putin, no, we don't negotiate over that. Big surprise that the war escalates, huh? And then in March 2022, the Russians and Ukrainians say, okay, we can settle this on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. So what happens? We know what happens. We know from insiders what happened. The United States and Britain told Ukraine, don't sign that agreement. Fight on. This is even the words of one of the biggest bumbling idiots of our modern statesmanship, Boris Johnson, who says Western hegemony depends on this. Are you kidding? Yeah, good. Okay, so negotiations stop. Ukraine leaves the negotiating table. Probably 1 million Ukrainians are dead or gravely wounded since that moment. Zelensky issues a decree because he rules by martial law. We say it's a democracy. He rules by martial law. And by martial law, he issues a decree. No negotiations with Russia. How clever. What about Europe's negotiators? Well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Borrell was not negotiating with Russia. He was warmongering.
We're blackmailing him.
Annalisa Baerbock, foreign minister of Germany. A word of peace? No, we will never negotiate until this moment. Okay, so finally negotiations are started. Maybe Ukraine will be saved by all of this. But the issue here is there's a history to this. If people really think that this started on February 22nd, 2022, my God, they could learn a little bit, that there's a little bit of background to this. They could understand what the U.S. is. They could understand what it means for my country, the United States, to have been engaged in 100 regime change operations since the end of World War II. 100. These are documented. This is, you destabilize regimes, you make coups. This is the game. They might even read the New York Times, which once in a while tells the truth, like the story about the CIA operations all across Ukraine aimed at destabilizing Russia. Is this how we behave as grown-ups in this world? Come on, this is so dangerous.
So we shouldn't follow what the US was doing as Europeans? This is basically what you're saying?
Of course, Europe should have a foreign policy, but a grown-up foreign policy. A grown-up foreign policy means you actually sit down and discuss your concerns with the other side. You don't just make hate speech or say, you're evil.
You're Hitler.
That's not negotiating. The idea that, negotiation is appeasement is Hitler, this is the only thing, so never talk to the other side. This is a little primitive in this world. Really primitive. But what's sad, I love Europe, and I am trying desperately for years to say to Europe, the U.S., you're going to put everything in that hand. You don't understand how the U.S. works. I'm sorry to say I was right. Now they're running. Oh my God, how could they do this? And I would say, how could you not understand? Maybe because I'm an American, I've lived through the Vietnam War. I've lived through the Contra Wars. I've lived through the 2 Iraq wars. I lived through the U.S. destabilization of Syria. I've lived through the U.S. destabilization of Libya. I've lived through the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. I've lived through the U.S. complicity in this massacre underway in Gaza. I've lived through every one of these. What would they like to know? That that's their great ally and shared values and all the rest? No, I'm afraid not. Europe needs a foreign policy.
So I'm stupid 24 years old, even though I'm a member of the European Parliament. But can you explain me simply how should we think about foreign policy as Europe? Because we don't really have a common army. This is a bit complex. How we should act as foreign policy, in your opinion, in Europe?
Yeah, first of all, it's a complicated, multipolar world with many great powers, not one. So it's not just the United States, but it's also Russia, it's China, it's India, and it should be Europe. Europe is a region of 400, of course, Europe is a region of 450 million people. It's got an economy that is around $20 trillion. It is the center of world culture and civilization, and it has foreign policy needs and risks. And just saying, okay, we let the US take care of all of this is not going to work. How's it going to work if the US invades Greenland? Is that going to work very well? How's it going to work if the United States threatens Europe in countless different ways, which it might? How's it going to work when the US has diplomacy with Russia and Europe does not? Even though Europe and Russia are on the same continent, the United States is thousands of miles away. How's that going to work? So Europe needs to act like Europe. If Europe acts like 27 individual countries, I'm sorry, it's going to get picked to pieces. I'm sorry about that. That, in fact, not only am I sorry about it.
Because everyone will disagree, right?
Well, everyone will disagree. And yeah, there's Russia, there's the United States doing this demand, there's this one making this demand, there's this one making this demand, internally disarray. How can that be to Europe's advantage? And, you know, as I study American history quite a bit, we had an experience, although it was more than 2 centuries ago. The United States started, as people know, as British colonies. There were 13 of them. Some had been set up by royal charter, some had been set up by migrants, and there were 13 distinct colonies. They united for the purpose of fighting for independence, starting around 1774, 1775, and then the Declaration of Independence in 1776. With French help, they beat the British. Without French help, by the way, no America as an independent country. But with the French help, France being a major power at the time, the British said, okay, have your independence. Treaty was reached in 1781. What happened then was something like the European Union. The 13 formed a kind of union, but it was a confederation, and the governing constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. It was very weak. You needed unanimity. The taxes were only at the state level, not at the federal level. There was no national defense. There was no national treaty making. It's a lot like Europe. You know, you need unanimity on all of these issues. By 1787, 6 years later, kind of miraculously, one leading politician said, we're going to go down the drain. The British are going to take us to pieces. The Spanish are going to take us to pieces. The Spanish were trying to block the American access to the Mississippi River and the port at New Orleans, for example. So they realized, and this one political entrepreneur, James Madison, realized, we better have a real union, not just a kind of we get together and we have a weak union where there's no real foreign policy, and maybe, I don't think they called it a high representative vice president in the United States, but we didn't have someone who could represent the United States. We didn't have the treaty-making power effectively. So they made a new constitution, and they made a federal government that created a real government. Frankly, Europe needs to be more united right now. How's it going to? Yes, how's it going to deal with Russia? How's it going to deal with China? How's it going to deal with the United States, if I could put it quite bluntly? And it needs actually a foreign policy. But then it needs to be a sensible foreign policy. If you live on the continent next to Russia, you don't stand up and scream every day, you're evil, you're evil, you're evil. You actually sit down, discuss, and negotiate. You don't let the United States blow up the pipeline that provides the energy for Europe and then sit there like a dumb idiot. We don't know who did it. Well, I can give you 50 quotations by American officials saying we'll never let that happen. I can quote on video, show you the President of the United States saying on February 7th, 2022, if Russia invades, Nord Stream will be finished. And then the reporter says, but Mr. President, how can you do that? And he says, believe me, we have our ways.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Is that a clue? Well, the Europeans couldn't figure that out, that little clue. There's Chancellor Scholz standing next to Biden. Quiet. He heard all of this. Then the pipeline gets blown up. We don't know who did it. We don't know. And then there are the investigations, but those have to be kept secret, even from the Bundestag, even from the public, even from the United Nations. This is not foreign policy. This is not foreign policy. This is doing what the United States wants, but now you obviously can't just follow Trump. Obviously, they thought naively they could follow Biden. I could have told them, and I did tell them repeatedly, no, you can't. You should understand the United States. You should understand how weak the foreign policy is. You should understand how crazy the idea of U.S. unipolarity is. Understand this. You know what I was told here? Don't talk to me anymore. Because to be anti-American, I'm not anti-American, I'm an American citizen. I have my job, I have my family, I'm trying to get American foreign policy not to wreck the world. But Europe should have its own foreign policy. This is the bottom line.
So to summarize what you said, you want Europe to stop following each other and just decide for themselves and for what is good for them.
Yes.
Make some alliance with Russia, make some alliance with China, make some alliance with United States when it's at use for us.
Exactly. And to understand, because Europe does understand. The best is to do all of this under the framework of multilateralism. Actually make the United Nations work. Now, strangely, if you ask of all the countries who ignores the UN the most, I'm sure every member of parliament would say, oh, Russia. But you know what? I've actually done the numbers across many different dimensions. It's not even close. The United States is the country that ignores the UN completely. Although the UN sits on the East River, I work at the UN for the last 25 years. The US is the country least aligned with the UN. And for Europe, which is it's a wonderful region of the world. It's got the highest living standards of the whole world. It needs its security. It needs to help other regions achieve this kind of quality of life, which is unique to Europe. But to do that, an effective United Nations is the most important way. And so when I say be Europe in a way that promotes also a global rule of law, a global multilateralism, and stop just ducking under the United States, whatever the US does. And if you see a coup led by the United States, don't just stand there and say, oh, we can't say anything. That's our ally. We share values with them. If you see pipelines being blown up, if you see regime change operations, you can't just say, oh, that is normal. If you see the US complicity in what Israel is doing in Gaza, which I believe is a genocide, you don't just sit there. You have your own policy. If you see, after negotiating with Iran, the JCPOA in 2015, 2016, and then Trump comes in 2017, blows it off, You don't just sit there quietly and say, that's our ally, the United States. We can't say anything. You have to have a European policy. Sometimes the U.S. will do things right. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes the U.S. may do something in the global interest. Often the U.S. won't. The U.S. just walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Where's Europe on this? Well, maybe they mumble a few words, oh, we don't like that. But that's our ally, the transatlantic relationship. I don't want Europe and the U.S. to be enemies. I want Europe to be a unified Europe as one of the great power centers of the world, because I do believe in Europe, and I do believe what Europe stands for, sustainable development, is crucial and can work for the world, but not if it's all subservient to some crazy ideas in Washington. The past ideas of Biden were the unipolar world. No. The current ideas are we take what we want. If we want Greenland, Canada, Panama, Gaza, we take it. Well, this is not going to work either. So Europe is going to need to have diplomacy. But if the diplomacy is only shouting against Russia, believe me, that's not diplomacy. That's not effective.
Not delusional diplomacy. Diplomacy based on ground truth.
Can I call it grown-up diplomacy? Not childish diplomacy, not propaganda-based diplomacy, not slogan-based diplomacy, not Russophobic diplomacy or Sinophobic diplomacy, but real diplomacy?